Globally, COVID-19 has infected nearly 3 million people. Sadly, around 200,000 have died. Millions have lost their jobs. Airlines and businesses have gone to the wall. And as a result, economists believe we are on the edge of a deep recession or even a depression. And we all just want to get out of lockdown. But what's next? What does the future hold? And can we know? Is there any hope?
Good evening and welcome once again to Predictions of Hope Beyond Corona, brought to you by the Hope Channel. I'm your host Rebecca, and it's a pleasure to have you joining us during this live broadcast tonight. Last night we had two amazing presentations from our presenters Gary Webster and Robbie Bergen. We saw in Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future that the ancient manuscripts are historically accurate. And in Beyond Reasonable Doubt, we looked at the remarkable prediction that pinpoints names, places, and characteristics of the succession of these three world empires. If you missed any of the topics so far, you can catch up on our website, hopechannel.com/predictions of hope. Once again, that link is hopechannel.com/predictions of hope. Now, once again, before we get started tonight, I want to let you know that we'll be offering you a great resource at the end of the program tonight. So stay tuned and get the code word and details on how to claim tonight's free gift. Well, as we continue our quest tonight for hope beyond Corona, Gary Webster will take us on a fascinating journey back in time to discover long-lost prophetic manuscripts concerning health, wellness, and Corona.
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, glad to be back with you again. We look forward to sharing some amazing things from the Middle Eastern part of our world, because we're going to go to health, wellness, and Corona, and Egypt and the future. You know, the ancient Egyptians were very interested in medicine. They had a lot of remedies, and you can see these in some of the papyrus documents that can be found. Just to illustrate here, this is papyrus. The ancient Egyptians wrote on this sort of paper reed. It's called papyrus, and they had many of these documents have been found. Some of them are what we call medical papyrus documents, and the Ebers papyrus from 1500 BC is one of them. But I want you to notice some of the remedies that came from ancient Egypt. For example, in the Ebers papyrus, we discover this first one, bloodletting. They believed in bloodletting. So, suck the blood out of someone, take it by sticking some leeches over the body or just giving an incision and letting the blood come out, because it was felt that this would help make people better. Well, we know today that's positively dangerous. I think it was George Washington that died from bloodletting. Here's another remedy that they had in ancient Egypt. If you have an eye problem, pour in hot broken glass. Well, that'd fix the eye. You wouldn't have an eye to get sore anymore, would you? But this was one of their practices. Here's another one. How about this for baldness? Apply the goose fat and crocodile dung, of all things. Now, that's probably why I'm losing my hair. I haven't been applying some of that lately. Better try that if you have a bald problem. Here's one more. What about if you get a splinter? This is interesting. Apply worm's blood and ass's dung. Now, no wonder they got lockjaw and tetanus and so on, because, of course, that's what you'd get from that. Now, let me tell you, the ancient Egyptians, while they had some very strange remedies, it wasn't all bad, let me tell you. In fact, they were very smart when it came to medical practices for their time. For example, you can visit the Komombo temple here on the way from Luxor down to Aswan, and you can visit this temple and you can see that they were very good into doing surgery. They had their surgical instruments, as you can see here. These are some of their surgical instruments that they used in doing their operations. They weren't too good at going too deep into the body because they didn't have good anesthetics or anything, but sort of fractures and so on, they were quite well equipped to do that. And then obstetrics and gynecology was another area that they were pretty good at. Here's a lady sitting on a birthing stool, and here's the birth of the baby. Rather rude coming into the world, a bit like a calf being born, in fact, if you look at it. But they were pretty good when it came to obstetrics and gynecology for their time. Now, the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, famous medical papyri document, as we said, came from about 1500 BC. Now, if you want to get your head around time frames, that's about the time of Moses. Now, I'm sure some of you saw The Prince of Egypt. Hollywood made Moses famous with that kids program, if you like, kids film. And then, of course, a bit earlier, there was Cecil B. DeMille's great epic, The Ten Commandments. This is the Moses we're talking about. He lived at the very time that these documents were actually written, the papyrus documents of the Ebers Papyrus and so on. Now, according to the biblical records, Moses was trained by the Egyptians, because we read in the biblical writings here some interesting things. If you remember the story of the Prince of Egypt, well, you'll remember that this was the case anyway, but the Bible says this: at this time Moses was born and was brought up in his father's house. He's an Israelite, his father, of course. Pharaoh's daughter took him away. You remember the story of Moses in the bulrushes, in the reeds there of the Nile. She took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So Moses went to the Egyptian universities, so to speak. He was trained in all the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, so he would have known about some of these things, these medical practices, both the good and the quackery that we just read as we started this particular program tonight. Now, the Ebers Papyrus, with all its strange things in it, let's just review them. Remember, bloodletting, eye problems, baldness, and splinters, all those remedies for those things. Imagine, if you would, if Moses had have included these in his writings. Just imagine how this book would have been laughed out, if those things were in this Bible. But they're actually not in the biblical records. Not there at all. But we do see that Moses had some very sound scientific health principles in his writings. Let me give you an illustration so we can get a handle on that, because it becomes very important when we look at what's taking place around us tonight with COVID-19, as you're going to see. For example, Moses talked a lot about hygiene, hand washing and so on, self-quarantining, which we're pretty much into, aren't we? Now, not only quarantining, but as I said, hand washing, these things were practiced in the biblical writings by Moses. He mentions these practices. Now, let me tell you that these things had not been known for many centuries until fairly recently. Let me give you an example. Here we are at one of the most prestigious hospitals in Europe in the 1840s, the Vienna General Hospital in Austria. This was regarded as one of the creme de la creme medical institutions back in those times. Now, on one occasion, a doctor was put in charge of a maternity ward. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, Ignaz was put in charge of this medical ward when the death rate among pregnant women in this hospital was just going through the roof. They were dying like flies, these pregnant women. And Ignaz thought, let me just observe the practices of the people who work in the hospital. So he watched, and what he noticed was this: the medical doctors, with their students in tow, would go to an autopsy room and examine, cut up the bodies to see how come things had happened overnight and they died. And they're putting their hands in the body of the dead person and so on, and then they're going straight to the maternity ward that Ignaz was in charge of and doing pelvic examinations on the women without doing any hand washing, because such things were not done in those days. So he wondered, I wonder if there's a connection between touching a dead body and then a living body. Perhaps we should introduce that we wash our hands. Smart idea when you consider what we do today. So he introduced that, and immediately the death rate plummeted in that hospital when they just washed their hands. Some time went by and the death rate shot through the roof again, and he wondered, what's going on now? So he watched what happened. The doctors would do a pelvic examination on a living woman, And then they'd go straight and do a pelvic examination on another living woman without washing their hands because they hadn't got that far yet. He thought, I wonder whether we should wash our hands between doing examinations on living person before we go to another living person. And so they did. And again, the death rate plummeted. Now, as I said, we smile today because, man, we're all supposed to wash our hands for 20 minutes. Not a bad idea during this COVID crisis. And you watch in a hospital, they wash very carefully. But these things were not known until only about 200 years ago. Yet, the biblical writings written by Moses have so much instruction on these things about washing your hands after you've been in contact with disease and so on, especially diseased bodies. Now, not only that, but Moses records how the Israelites who were travelling from Egypt over into what we call Palestine today, on the way they came through the Sinai desert region. And what happens when you go to the toilet when you've got a mass of people? Well, he said, well, God told him, make sure you put your toilet outside the camp. And when you take it, take a shovel with you to bury it. Now, we, of course, that's common sense today, but let me tell you, it wasn't always common sense even in Europe until recent times. Because, for example, in some places, in some cities, the potty was in the kitchen. Nice place for it, isn't it? But that's where they had it. So what are you going to do with this? Well, you want to empty it, of course, but where do you empty it and when do you empty it? Well, you empty it at night time when everybody's asleep. And so you empty it out the window, out onto the streets. But every other neighbour's doing the same thing, so you can understand why sometimes we have these plagues going through Europe. This is one of the reasons. Hygiene was not a really known thing in many places, even in Europe. It's only the last 200 or 300 years that we've come up to knowledge on these things. Yet the biblical writings have it 3,500 years ago. In fact, that's exactly what science tells us. The idea of contagion, passing on diseases, was foreign to the classic medical tradition and found no place in the voluminous Hippocratic writings. He's the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, so didn't find a place there in those writings. However, notice what it says. The Old Testament, however, is a rich source for contagionist sentiment. In other words, medical science today recognises that the Bible had these principles so long ago that God gave to Moses, according to the Bible. That's where he got them from. Now, not only that, Moses wrote sound scientific health principles that clearly show us what we're doing today with COVID-19 works. We have social distancing, don't we, of course? We have the hand washing. We've caught up with that, of course, in more recent times, as we've just indicated, but it was there in the biblical writings. But not only that, Moses wrote of how we could actually have a much stronger immune system. Now, of course, he didn't know about the immune system, but these things were communicated to him about some of the practices that they needed to do to make sure they have a good immune system. We can use those principles today, let me assure you. For example, in these sound scientific health principles that Moses wrote about for a strong immune system, we pick this one up concerning nutrition and diet. And much is being said today in our fight against COVID-19 about making sure we have a good diet because it helps our immune system in this area. For example, God gave to him the instruction that plant-based diet was the best for optimal health. For example, this is what Moses wrote on the first page of his book in the biblical manuscripts. God said, "Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for food." In other words, there it is. First page of the Bible, the optimal diet, if you can get it, a plant-based diet would be the best. Now, we almost smile today because that's what the doctors and the scientists are telling us. It's in so many places, in so much literature today, medical literature. This is very good for optimal health today. It's being recognised scientifically. Studies have been done on a number of groups around the world who tend to live longer and healthier than other groups, and this is one of the key things they're discovering, that a plant-based diet can be very helpful to having optimal health. Another one that Moses talked about, he was told, he said in his writings, we should avoid animal fat. Notice what it said here in the book of Leviticus that Moses wrote, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, you shall eat no manner of fat of ox or sheep or of goat." Now, of course, almost ad nauseum, the doctors will tell us, avoid fats because they can cause problems with our arteries and so on. We know that today. So much has been written about that, but not so many years ago we weren't aware of that, yet the biblical writings tell us about that so long ago. We're talking 3,500 years ago. So the doctors tell us, cut back on meats today to make sure you can have optimal health. Now I want to bring you to an interesting story which connects us now with the prophecies. What we're seeing here is, again, this book is not only historically accurate, it's actually got scientifically sound health principles here. And it's so practical and relevant to today. But let's come to another one which illustrates, because it brings us to this great book of Daniel, who has some of these predictions dealing with our time that we're looking at. Nebuchadnezzar, as we said, made 3 raids against Jerusalem back in 605, 597 and 586 BC. When he made those raids each time, he took captives from Jerusalem to the city of Babylon. Among the captives was a king by the name of Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin is mentioned in the biblical records. Let me share that with you. We read it in the book of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar, there's the man that we looked at in a previous program, he took Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. So specifically mentions this king by name. Secondly, it mentions that he was given a food ration. So the biblical writers mention a food ration. Now this is written 600 BC. Notice what it says. As for his, that's Jehoiachin it's talking about, his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king of Babylon. A portion for each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. In other words, on Tuesdays you get pavlova for breakfast. Thursdays you have fried fish. Well, you know what I mean. It's the rations that he's given as a captive. Now, amazingly, when the German archaeologists began to excavate in Mesopotamia, they discovered the very ration tablet of Jehoiachin. You can see it today in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Just as the biblical writers had said, here is his ration tablet. Again, historical accuracy, but it connects us with another mention of a ration that's given to another man in the same city, and that's Daniel. When we notice the story of Daniel, Daniel was a captive of the Babylonians. He was taken in the first raid in 605 BC. And when he came into the king's palace, of course the king had the food that he was accustomed to, and Daniel was fed from the king's table and his friends. I want you to notice what Daniel's reaction was, and we'll see why. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion. That's the word ration that we have for Jehoiachin. Would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Because the Babylonians were not aware of those principles that Moses had shared. Make sure you don't have fat in the diet and other things that are mentioned by Moses. So Daniel wanted to make sure he had the best for optimal health. So he refuses politely to eat the king's food. Notice what happens. So Daniel said to the steward, "Please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink." By vegetables, he's meaning fruits and all that sort of thing. Just give us a plant-based diet and give us water to drink and give us a test for just 10 days. He's wanting the biblical ideal diet, in other words. I want to go back to that. He said, I want to stay with what we've been used to, if you could. Now at the end, it says, at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion or the ration of the king's delicacies. So just in 10 days, it was seen that a plant-based diet, just with good fresh water which comes out of the tap, was optimal for health. They looked better. Well, of course, they on this diet for 3 years, according to the book of Daniel. They eat that sort of a diet. And at the end, they've got to have their examinations. So I want you to notice the examination. When the king examined these guys, let's notice what took place. In all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers who were in all his realm. So Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So notice what happened here. When the king examined them after they'd been on that diet, they were found to be better than the rest in mentally and so on. Now, the principles, and we've only shared 2 or 3 of them here in our program this evening because of time as well, but the principles that are found in this book that concern so many areas of health that you find here were actually researched, as it were, by 2 doctors some years ago, Doctors Breslow and Belloc at the University of California. What they did was a 9-year study, and it revealed that the biblical health principles that we've read about and others that are mentioned added 11.5 years of good quality life. In other words, when people are in better health, they're better able to fight disease and a lot of other things as well. So this is what research has shown, but those principles were already in this book so long ago. Sound scientific health principles, you see, which is why God made a prediction, if you like, if people went on this diet. Notice what it says. Moses is writing for God, he says, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Interestingly, archaeologists and medical people, I should say, have taken some of those mummies and they've done autopsies on them and discovered that the Egyptians had all sorts of what we would call modern lifestyle diseases, which one can avoid when we follow the principles that Dr. Bellow and Breslow discovered and what the Bible actually mentions in its writings. So you see, what we're seeing in this, as we go back to ancient Egypt in terms of its health and wellness, and to Israel, is this. We discover that the biblical writings are again historically accurate, but more than just historically accurate, correct and reliable information, even in the area of looking after health. One of the great things we discovered. But also we've seen, and we'll see in Robbie's next presentation, a very proven track record of dependable predictions. And Robbie will be taking us down into our own day-to-day as we go to the prophecies of Daniel. Starts out with him looking after his health, ends up with him making incredible predictions. So you're going to be able to clearly see exactly where these predictions are leading us today. By the way, if you'd like a little more information on how to have better health to be able to fight COVID-19 and anything else that comes along, just go down under the screen. There are some resources on health that you'll find very helpful in your own life.
How incredible to discover that the ancient biblical manuscripts are not only historically accurate and prophetically reliable, but are also scientifically sound and actually relevant for us today. In our next presentation tonight, The Last Empire, Back to the Future, Robbie's going to take us back once again to some ancient predictions that were written more than 2,500 years ago that don't just talk about the past, but actually talk about our day in which we're living.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kaiser Wilhelm was the emperor of Germany during World War I, and he was famously asked to repair the roof of a very well-known cathedral, the Metz Cathedral, which is in modern-day France, but during World War I, it was in the German territory. Now, when Kaiser Wilhelm was asked to repair this roof, he said he would on one condition. He said, "Your cathedral has a statue of Daniel the prophet at the front of it." He said, "Remove Daniel's head and replace it with mine," and then he would repair the roof. Now, why did Kaiser Wilhelm bring Daniel the prophet into his negotiation? Well, he's reportedly has said this: "Daniel's prophecy does not fit in with my plans. I cannot accept that. Where Charlemagne and others have failed, I will succeed." We saw in our last presentation that the book of Daniel is clearly a 6th century BC document and contains predictions about ancient empires. But the predictive focus of the book of Daniel is actually more for our time than for the time in which it was written. After the first chapter, which details that Babylonian captivity, we're introduced to an absolutely incredible story and prediction in chapter 2. It's the story of a disturbing dream. The story goes that there is a king, his name is Nebuchadnezzar, and he has a dream one night, and when he wakes up, he cannot remember the dream. Now, we understand from archaeological diggings that the reason he was probably disturbed is because of these dream omen tablets. The Babylonians considered that all dreams were some kind of omen about the future. And you can understand why, if you can't remember the dream about the future, you could see why you'd be disturbed. So the king calls in the story all of his advisors and astrologers and magicians. Now, an astrologer is basically someone that could look for patterns in the stars and somehow tell the future. And the magicians are what we would call ancient psychics. Now, when these guys come to the king, they ask, "What's the dream, king?" And we'll tell you the meaning. Now, the problem is the king doesn't remember the dream. So he says to them, "You tell me the dream that I had, and then I will know for sure that you got the interpretation right." Well, they obviously say, "We don't know how to do that. There's no one that could do that." And they'd be right. And so the king gets furious with these wise men, and he decides if they don't tell him what he dreamt with the interpretation, execution is the only option. Now, this is where Daniel comes back into the story. Daniel wasn't one of these astrologers or magicians, but he was considered one of the young wise men. So when the executioner comes to Daniel and tells him, "Daniel, your head's on the block, so to speak," Daniel asks why, and he's told it's because of this dream. So Daniel goes to the king, and he asks the king for time to inquire of his God to get the dream and its interpretation. So the king gives him his time, and we find in the next scene that Daniel turns to God in help. He does the same thing that probably most of us would do if we were in a similar circumstance. We pray. In fact, there's that old saying that in foxholes, there's no atheist. And in this case, Daniel goes, "God, help us or we're dead meat." In the next scene, Daniel claims that that same night, his God in heaven gave him the dream that the king had. In the dream, Daniel claims that he saw an image of a man. And this man is made of various metals. We see a golden head, a silver chest, a bronze waist, and iron legs and feet of iron and clay. And then he says that he sees this great rock cut out without hands that comes down and smashes this image on its feet and breaks the whole thing into pieces. This is what Daniel claims. So the next scene, Daniel goes back to the king to tell the king what he dreamt. Now, as Daniel does this, he claims that the God of heaven has shown him this. He takes no responsibility for his own gifts or talents in explaining this dream. But in the next couple of verses, Daniel sort of pulls back the window of the future. And as he articulates this dream that the king had, it ends with the last empire, this rock that wipes out this image. Now, Daniel is keen to tell the king what he dreamt. So Daniel starts interpreting this dream to the king by starting at the head of the image. He says, "You are this head of gold," referring to Nebuchadnezzar and representing the kingdom of Babylon. So this head of gold is Babylon from 605 BC down to 539 BC. And it's quite fitting that the prediction uses gold as its symbol. Archaeologists have found now in Babylon that there was excessive use of gold throughout the empire. In fact, in one temple alone, some of the gold that made up the altars there and some of the furniture weighed 7,000 kilograms of gold. Absolutely incredible. But what happened to Babylon? Well, Daniel continues telling the king what this dream means. He says, "But after you," so after Babylon, "shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours." Now, we've already seen in our previous presentation in Daniel chapter 8 that Medo-Persian Empire was the empire that conquered Babylon. So Babylon is followed by this chest of arms of silver representing by the Medo-Persian Empire, which reigned from 539 to 331 BC. But Daniel's not finished yet. He continues on and says to the king, "Then a third kingdom of bronze, which would rule over all the earth." We've already seen that the empire that came after Medo-Persia was Greece. And we saw that it took place in 331 BC when Alexander the Great marched in with his armies in their bronze armor, with their bronze shields, with their bronze helmets, with their bronze swords. They were very fittingly described as the Bronze Empire. With uncanny accuracy, we see these predictions. So this bronze belly and thighs represents Greece, which ruled from 331 down to 168 BC. But Daniel's not finished yet. He claims that God is showing that there will be another kingdom. It says, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And as we've already seen, the next empire on the world scene was Rome. Rome representing by these legs, this imperial Roman Empire from 168 down to 476 AD. But Daniel wasn't finished yet. He continues on and says that the kingdom, that's the Roman kingdom, that fourth kingdom, the kingdom of iron legs, the kingdom shall be divided. The feet of iron and clay represent the dividing of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. Now, what's absolutely amazing with this prophecy is that Daniel doesn't claim that there'll be a fifth world empire, but that the fourth would divide. And when we look at history, we see exactly that taking place. The Roman Empire, what we would call Western Roman Empire, started to collapse between 351 down to 476 AD as a result of the Germanic tribes invading into the Western Empire and eventually becoming what we call today Western Europe. And so when we look at this image, we find it absolutely remarkable that Daniel is claiming that Babylon would fall to Medo-Persia, Persia would fall to Greece, Greece to Rome, and Rome into a divided state, which we now understand to be Western Europe. Absolutely remarkable. But the prophecy goes on and claims that this kingdom would never reunite. As you saw iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but will not adhere one to another, just as iron does not mix with clay. The prophecy is that this Roman Empire, which is divided into Western Europe, will never reunite ever again. Many attempts have tried throughout the centuries, but every attempt uncannily has failed. We see that Charlemagne tried to unite Europe under the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, and he failed. We see Louis XIV of France try, and he failed. We even see Napoleon. He wrote this. He said, there will be one Europe, there'll be one currency, there'll be one language, there'll be one government over all of Europe. This is the 1800s. And yet after his defeat in the Battle of Waterloo, he writes this in his journal, God Almighty is too much for me. Now we can understand why Kaiser Wilhelm wrote this, remove Daniel's head and replace it with mine. But we also know Kaiser Wilhelm failed in his attempts to have a super state in Europe. And then, of course, we can't forget Adolf Hitler. In the Second World War, he wrote, one people, one empire, one leader. But once again, the prophecy stands. The prophecy said they will not adhere one to another. And Adolf Hitler came to his end as well. And the Bible even predicts that there would be the attempt to use marriage relationships to reunite this divided empire. Notice this. They will mix with one another in marriage. If you go to Frederiksberg Castle in Denmark, you'll find a series of paintings, great oil paintings depicting the houses of royalty across Western Europe and how they attempted to bring unity and control through marriage, and yet every one of those attempts have also failed. And today, in our very time right now, there is another attempt to unite Europe. We call it the European Union. In the early 1990s, when this was being formed into what we see today as the European Union, the previous president of France, François Mitterrand, he said, a great power is being born. At the same time, in Germany, the Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, says, the course is irreversible. The president of the European Commission at the same time, Romano Prodi, wrote this, we can and will succeed in creating a united, prosperous, democratic Europe where citizens can live in peace and freedom. And yet, in our time, this very year, we have seen Brexit, the divorcing of one of the European member states. The prophecy was very clear. They will never be reunited again into a single empire. But the prophecy hasn't finished yet. Daniel comes along to the king and says, you watched while a stone was cut out without hands, and you watch it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke it into pieces. This stone represents the final empire in Earth's history. Absolutely remarkable that in just over 140 words, we get 2,600 years of human history, starting with Babylon and taking us all the way down to a divided Europe, the time in which we are living today. In this prophecy, we find 7 predictive elements. We see Babylon mentioned, we see Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, a dividing of Rome, and then a promise that it would never unite again, followed by that last empire. 7 predictive elements. And as we look at this prophecy, we find that 6 of the 7 have been completely fulfilled. 6 out of 7. Only 1 is left, and it's not fulfilled because we're still waiting for it. Now, if you just look at the sheer force of logic here and reason, you will find that it is highly probable that if the 6 have been fulfilled, as mentioned, the 7th is very, very, very likely to be fulfilled as well. I propose this. Either we are dealing with a hoax, an incredible hoax, or in fact we are dealing with something that is supernatural. Now, I have to admit, when I first read this prophecy, I was skeptical, to say the least. I mean, 140 words describing 2,600 years of human history by one person? Incredible. But when you examine it, you have to admit there's something here that's worth investigating. We've seen in Gary's presentations that we have historical accuracy with these documents. That's our first ingredient we need for finding reliable prophecy. And then we have seen in our last couple of presentations, we have a proven track record of dependable predictions. Daniel's words to the king in closing, in giving this dream and its interpretation was, "King, the dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure." The narrative of this prediction it suggests that we're not alone. In fact, our lives are often characterized by uncertainty and anxiety and fear, especially in the time we're living right now. Many of us around Australia and New Zealand, we don't know what's going to happen with our jobs in the coming weeks and months. Some of us have questions about our health and our families. But this narrative of this prediction suggests that we're not alone. It suggests that there's somebody out there, something supernatural, who has a plan, has a purpose, who has a schedule, giving us a sense of certainty in our own lives. According to Daniel, this information came from his God, a supernatural being. And if he knows the future, then the implication is that he knows your future.
What an astounding prediction. Once again, its accuracy defies reason and logic. We've seen that we are living in the days of a divided Europe. And as recent as this year with Brexit, we're witnessing the fulfillment of the prediction that Europe will strive to be united, but their efforts will never last. Amazing. Tonight's 2 presentations bring us into our day. But what's next? Do these ancient predictions say anything more about our time? About what's coming next? Join us tomorrow as we explore these questions. But before we go tonight, we'd love to get some great resources into your hands. We want to offer you tonight the award-winning DVD called Beyond Conflict. All you have to do is text tonight's code word DREAM to +61 428 833 386 and follow the instructions. Again, text tonight's code word DREAM to +61 428 833 386 and follow the instructions. It's as simple as that. Please join me again tomorrow night at 7:30 for Predictions of Hope Beyond Corona as we explore the topics of Jerusalem Countdown and Global Economic Meltdown. Good night.